The First City National Bank Tower in Houston, Texas, 75 floors, 1.2 million square feet, completed in 1981 at the absolute peak of the Texas oil boom, was 90% vacant within 5 years of its completion. Not 10% vacant, not 30% vacant, 90% vacant, in a building that had been fully leased before construction was complete. The collapse from full occupancy to near total vacancy in less than a decade is one of the most extreme documented instances of commodity-driven commercial real estate market dislocation in American corporate history. And it is forensically interesting not because it was caused by financial engineering failure or management incompetence, but because it was caused by something more fundamental. The oil price dropped from approximately $35 per barrel in 1981 to approximately $10 per barrel in 1986. And when it did, the entire rationale for the Houston office market that had existed when the building was designed evaporated with it. The building did not fail. The commodity that had built the economy around it failed first. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between a single commodity regional economy and the commercial real estate infrastructure it generates during the commodity's peak, because Houston, in the early 1980s, is the most precisely documented case in American real estate history of what happens when a city builds more office infrastructure than its economy can absorb at peak before the peak ends. Subscribe now, because what happened in Houston between 1981 and 1986 is happening in a different city right now, and the number on the petroleum index is not the only signal you should be reading. Houston's commercial real estate market in the late 1970s and early 1980s was the most actively constructed major office market in the United States, driven by the specific demand dynamics of an energy sector that was simultaneously expanding its workforce, its revenues, and its institutional ambition in response to the oil price environment that the 1973 OPEC embargo and the 1979 Iranian Revolution had created. The oil companies that headquartered in Houston, Tenneco, Pennzoil, Texas Eastern, Shell Oil, and dozens of others were generating revenues that their pre-1973 projections had not contemplated, and they were responding to those revenues by expanding their physical footprint at a rate that reflected the permanence of the oil price environment they were operating in, rather than the historical volatility of the commodity whose pricing drove their businesses. The specific covenant that Houston's real estate market did not read carefully enough between 1975 and 1981 was the one embedded in the relationship between the oil price environment that was driving the office demand and the oil price environment's historical volatility, which had produced a complete cycle from $3 per barrel in 1970 to $35 per barrel in 1981, without any participant in the market consistently treating the $35 price as a temporary peak rather than a permanent new baseline. The First City National Bank Tower was designed for a permanent new baseline that did not exist. The building's 75 floors represented the architectural expression of every energy company's belief that Houston's position at the center of the global energy industry was a permanent competitive advantage rather than a cyclical phenomenon, whose expression in commercial real estate square footage would eventually need to be absorbed by a market that the commodity's price volatility could rapidly deprive of the demand that had made the development rational. The building was not wrong as a building, it was wrong as a forecast, as the specific mechanism by which the Houston commercial real estate market's oil-driven vacancy crisis destroyed First City National Bank, the building's namesake and primary tenant anchor, illustrates the compound financial vulnerability that single commodity regional real estate markets create when the commodity's price cycles. Energy companies whose revenues had contracted sharply in response to the oil price declined from $35 to $10 per barrel between 1981 and 1986, responded by reducing their office space requirements at approximately the same rate their revenues had declined. Lease renewals were not executed. Excess space was sublet at prices that devastated the primary landlord's rental income. New lease demand from energy sector companies essentially ceased. First City National Bank's exposure to the Houston real estate market was not merely as a landlord, it was as a lender. The bank had made substantial commercial real estate loans to Houston developers during the construction boom, and those loans began defaulting as the developers' projects encountered the vacancy rates that the oil price collapse had produced. The bank's regulatory capital was simultaneously being eroded by real estate loan losses and by the reduced value of the equity investments it had made in Houston development projects. The First City National Bank Tower, whose construction the bank had funded in part, became the most visible symbol of a financial institution that was failing because its fortunes were insufficiently insulated from the fortunes of the regional economy it had been built to serve. First City Bank Corporation failed in 1988, at the time one of the largest bank failures in Texas history. The building that bore its name remained substantially vacant for years after its namesake's failure, a physical monument to the specific proposition that a building can be excellently designed, well constructed, and financially sound in every conventionally measurable sense, and still be the wrong building in the wrong city at the wrong moment in the commodity cycle. The recovery trajectory of Houston's commercial real estate market after the oil bust of 1986 documents the specific dynamic that commodity-driven real estate gluts produce. Recovery is slow, non-linear, and dependent on demand from sectors other than the commodity whose contraction created the vacancy, sectors that take years to develop sufficient scale to absorb the infrastructure that the commodity's peak had overproduced. Houston's commercial real estate market did not recover to pre-bust occupancy levels until the mid-1990s, a decade after the oil price's most dramatic decline. The recovery was driven not by oil's return to $35 per barrel, which did not happen until the 2000s, but by the gradual development of Houston's economy into a more diversified base that included healthcare, logistics, and technology sectors, whose demand for office space was less correlated to the oil price than the energy sector's demand had been. The First City National Bank Tower has been occupied and operational across the intervening decades, its initial vacancy crisis resolved by the same diversification dynamic that rescued the broader Houston market. The building that was a monument to the oil boom's architectural ambition is now a fully occupied commercial address in a Houston economy whose relationship with the oil price, while still meaningful, is substantially less determinative than it was in 1981. What the First City National Bank Tower case reveals, in the context of this channel's 92-case archive, is a category of real estate failure that no financial engineering failure caused and no financial engineering solution could have prevented. The systematic overproduction of commercial real estate infrastructure during a commodity cycle peak, funded by lenders whose underwriting was calibrated to the peak commodity price, rather than to the commodity's historical volatility range. The building was the right building. The market was the wrong market at the wrong moment. The recovery that eventually validated the building's quality required a decade and an economic diversification that no individual property owner's decision could have produced. Houston recovered, the building is occupied, First City National Bank is not. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication.